The crane was in the ground up to its axles. Not dramatically, no crack, no warning. The earth had simply yielded under the load the way soft earth always yields under a load it cannot carry. Slowly, quietly, and with a finality that was, from the perspective of the man watching from the site office, absolute. By 7:15 Tuesday morning, the Liebherr LTM 1080, the largest machine on the site, worth over 800,000 marks, had settled 60 centimeters on its front right corner. The cab tilted at an angle that made its operator, a young man from Augsburg named Thays who had been driving cranes for 6 years, feel strongly about remaining in the cab until he received specific instructions otherwise. The concrete mixer waiting at the gate had its drum turning slowly, its contents becoming less useful with every passing minute. The site had stopped. The schedule had stopped. Everything had stopped, and in the particular silence that falls over a construction site when a very large machine is no longer doing what it is supposed to do, Werner Skahl had stood at the edge of the sunken crane and thought about his bonus. He was 43 years old, site manager for Baugesellschaft Kernbach GmbH. This factory, a chemical processing plant for a company whose name appeared on half the cleaning products in German supermarkets, was the largest project of his career. 14 months to completion, a bonus clause tied to it, and until 7:15 that morning, a project on schedule. If this is your first story on this channel, subscribe and hit the bell. New story every single day. Now let me tell you about the ground beneath that construction site, because the ground is where this story lives. The factory occupied 12 hectares of former farmland north of Munich, purchased from a man named Karl Huber in spring 1968 after 2 years of company approaches, and a fair price. The site survey had found the land suitable. What the survey did not find, what no survey of engineers unfamiliar with this specific ground could easily find, was the drainage network Karl had laid beneath the eastern section himself, beginning in autumn 1955. 3 weeks of work, clay pipes in trenches 60 centimeters deep, running diagonally across a waterlogged corner to the boundary ditch at the field's edge. The work had solved the problem completely. He had filled the trenches, seeded them over, and within 2 seasons the surface showed no sign of what lay below. When the construction bulldozers arrived in 1968, they removed the topsoil without knowing about the channels. The old clay pipes cracked under the earth-moving equipment. The drainage was gone. What remained was disturbed, water-retaining subsoil beneath unconsolidated construction fill invisible from the surface, carrying exactly enough hidden instability to swallow a Liebherr LTM 1080 when the opportunity arose. Werner Skahl did not know any of this. Karl Huber knew all of it. The recovery attempts ran for 2 days. A smaller crane from Munich took the load on a sling until its own rear outrigger began to sink and the operator disengaged. A heavy recovery truck from Augsburg sank 12 centimeters in its first approach and reversed to the entrance without comment. Heavy timber boards were laid as a weight distribution platform, helped briefly, and were pushed into the soft ground themselves. By Wednesday afternoon, Skahl had spent 2 days watching 350,000 marks of recovery equipment achieve nothing. The engineering director in Munich had called twice. The client liaison had called 3 times. The deadline had not moved. It was at 4:15 Wednesday, while Skahl stood at the edge of the mud with no remaining ideas, that he became aware of something at the eastern boundary fence. An old man on an old tractor, watching. Karl Huber had been watching since Tuesday morning. He had seen the crane tilt from across his adjacent field, had been on his Lanz doing the morning's work when the tilt happened, stopped to watch for a few minutes, then returned to his row. That afternoon he had driven to the site gate. Skahl had come to meet him. "This was my field," Karl said. "The eastern corner where the machine went in. I know what is under there." Skahl had looked at the Lanz, the open seat, the single exhaust pipe, the age of everything about it. "We have recovery equipment coming from Munich and Augsburg," he said, not unkind. Simply a man operating within a definition of what a solution looked like, and what Karl was presenting did not match it. "We have it handled." Karl nodded and drove back to his work. He returned to the boundary Wednesday morning. He did not go to the gate. He parked the Lanz at the fence and watched the Augsburg truck make its approach and retreat. He watched the boards sink. He watched the Munich engineers walk the problem area with instruments and speak into their radios and arrive at nothing that produced movement. He sat on the iron seat with his arms folded and watched with the patient steadiness of a man who has already done his calculation and is simply waiting for the world to catch up to it. At 4:15, he drove to the gate again. Skal came this time without being asked. Let me tell you what Karl understood that the engineers did not. Because this is the mechanical truth of what happens next, and without it the rest is only theater. The Liebherr weighed 82 tons distributed across 4 outrigger pads and 2 axles, 8 load points, each concentrating significant force into a small surface area. On firm consolidated ground this is manageable. On unconsolidated construction fill above a collapsed drainage channel, the bearing pressure beneath each outrigger exceeded what the subsoil could support, and the machine sank. Every recovery vehicle brought to the site had the same problem. Not total weight, weight per unit area. Ground bearing pressure. Narrow tires and concentrated outrigger loads created pressure the disturbed fill could not carry. The boards had briefly increased the distribution area but lacked the stiffness to sustain it. The soft ground had won every engagement. The Lanz Bulldog D4016 that Karl had worked this field with for 14 years weighed 3,200 kilograms. Its wide, low-pressure agricultural tires had a ground contact area approximately 4 times larger per unit of weight than any vehicle on site. The bearing pressure beneath the Lanz's tires on soft soil was less than that of a walking man. This was not coincidence. The machine had been designed for waterlogged fields, soft clay subsoil, the heavy wet ground of a Bavarian autumn. The construction fill on the eastern section was producing exactly those conditions, and the Lanz had been built for exactly those conditions 14 years before the construction company arrived. But tire pressure was only part of what Karl brought. He knew the drainage channel ran diagonally from the northeast corner of the site to the boundary ditch. He knew it was 60 centimeters deep, making the ground above it the most unstable section of the eastern area. He knew the firm clay layer was at 30 centimeters on the western side of the channel and 90 centimeters on the eastern side, because he had dug the channel himself, measured every meter, and watched the ground respond across 14 seasons of wet and dry. He also knew, and this had occurred to none of the engineers, that the crane had not sunk merely because it was in soft ground. It had positioned itself directly above the point where 2 drainage channel branches met, the single most unstable point on the entire site, a void left by the collapse of the old clay pipe junction. Every recovery attempt from the north had approached directly over the continuation of the main channel line, the softest possible ground from the worst possible direction, chosen by engineers who could not know what lay beneath because nothing visible told them and no document recorded it. The approach had to come from the west, from the old field margin where Karl had always parked his machinery, because the field margin sat on consolidated clay 30 centimeters down that would not move under any load he could put on it. None of this existed in any document Werner Skal's engineers had access to. It existed in Karl Huber's memory, in his hands, in 14 years of working this specific earth. When Skal came to the gate on Wednesday afternoon, Karl was already off the Lanz. Herr Huber, Skal said. He had learned the name. Karl noted this as a small courtesy. The channel runs from the northeast corner, Karl said, without preliminary. 2 branches meet directly under your crane. You cannot approach from the north. The firm ground is on the western margin where my old fence posts are. Skal looked at the Lanz, then at the crane, then back at Karl. Can it pull 80 tons? He asked. No, Karl said. It does not need to. Once the front outrigger has traction, the crane can drive itself. I pull from the west on a diagonal, the crane engages its own drive on the firm section, and the machine walks out. Skal looked at the site, at the failed approach tracks from the north. The young engineer from the Munich office made a sound, not quite a laugh, but close enough to be unmistakable. Skal turned and looked at him. The sound stopped. "All right," Skal said. "What do you need from us?" "Keep everyone off the western approach," Karl said, "and tell your operator to be ready." He walked back to the Lanz and opened the blowtorch valve. Subscribe now if you have not, because what happens on this construction site in the next 30 minutes is exactly why this channel exists. The Glühkopf ritual on a muddy construction site looks different than in a barn, but it is the same ritual. The blowtorch held steady against the cast-iron hot bulb chamber at the crown of the single cylinder. The weighting, not by any clock on the site office wall, not by any timer, but by the color of the iron. Not the bright orange of too much heat, not the unrevealing dark of too little. The particular dull red-orange that meant the metal had absorbed exactly enough to ignite fuel on contact and fire reliably. Karl had known this color since he was 8 years old, sitting beside his father's machine in a different field in a different year, learning how to wait for something that could not be hurried. 7 minutes, the color arrived. He set the blowtorch aside with the care he applied to small tasks even when large things were happening. He lifted the starting crank, heavy iron, the handle worn smooth in the exact shape of his grip after 14 years, and turned it once. The flywheel moved. He turned it again, his full weight committed to the rotation, feeling the compression build in the cylinder. On the third turn, the engine fired. Pum! A half-second of silence. Then pum! The flywheel had its rhythm. Pum, pum, pum. 1 beat per second. Heavy, deliberate, without hesitation or fluctuation. The exhaust pipe sent a thin thread of dark smoke into the September air. The Lance's iron frame settled into its deep, steady vibration, a vibration you could feel through the soles of your boots if you stood within 3 meters, the vibration of a single large cylinder doing exactly what it was designed to do, at exactly the speed it was designed to do it. Every man at the fence line went quiet. The engineer who had made the sound went quiet. Werner Skal, standing at the western margin, went quiet. Karl climbed onto the open seat, no cab, no windshield, no protection between him and the September morning, and settled onto it with the complete absence of ceremony of a man sitting in his own chair. He attached the winch cable to the drawbar hook, checked the drum engagement, checked the approach line one final time against his old fence posts. Then he drove onto the site. Not fast. He went slowly, following the western approach line he had walked in his head since Tuesday morning. Not the shortest route to the crane, but the correct one. Staying west of the channel's main run, keeping the Lance on the consolidated clay he knew was there, because he had broken it with his own plow in 1955 and watched it settle through 14 working seasons. The ground under the wide tires was soft in places, the soft of wet-worked ground, not the dangerous soft of the eastern section. The tires pressed in without spinning. The broad tread distributed weight across a footprint that left clean impressions in the mud but did not sink. Pum, pum, pum. 1 beat, 1 slow meter. The men at the fence watched in the way men watch when they sense that what they are seeing might matter but are not yet certain how. Skal was still at the western margin, not moving. Karl reached the position he had calculated 7 meters west of the crane, on a diagonal giving him the pull angle to extract the front right outrigger from the void beneath it. He stopped, checked against the fence posts and the boundary ditch, confirmed he was where he needed to be. He climbed down. He walked to the crane and attached the winch cable to the chassis tow point directly above the sunken corner, the frame hook, not the outrigger, the attachment that pulled at the angle that mattered. He checked it, he walked back, he climbed on. He engaged the winch drum. Pum, pum, pum. The cable began to take tension. The engine note did not change. The flywheel turned at the same steady pace it had been turning since the third rotation of the crank. The winch drum collected cable with the slow mechanical patience of something that does not know it is supposed to be in a hurry. The tension built not with a snap or a jerk, but with the gradual accumulation of force that was the Lance's fundamental character. A single large cylinder, a massive flywheel, gears that multiplied torque rather than RPM. The cable straightened, lifting fractionally from the mud. The crane made sounds. The deep, particular creak of an 82-ton machine being asked, for the first time in 2 days, to respond to a force working with its geometry rather than against it. The engine dropped perhaps 10 RPM. The flywheel absorbed the load. The exhaust thread darkened slightly. Then something moved. Not the crane itself. The ground's relationship with the crane changed. The front right outrigger pad, held partly by suction from the soft soil encasing it, broke free of that suction as the diagonal pull shifted the load distribution. A specific sound, wet earth releasing iron. The sound that tells a man who knows machinery that something fixed has become movable. Karl held the throttle exactly where it was. Not further, not back. He held it and let the machine do what the machine knew how to do, accumulate force steadily, without surging, without releasing, applying pressure the way an experienced hand applies pressure to a stuck fitting. Constant, patient, the right direction, the right amount. Skal was behind the line Karl had asked them to observe. He had not moved. The crane shifted, a few centimeters of the front right corner lifting fractionally. The outrigger pad finding slightly firmer ground 2 centimeters to the west of where it had been. Thays in the cab felt it through the floor, the small relief of tension that had been holding the machine canted for 2 days. He engaged the crane's own drive. Carefully. The way an experienced operator handles a machine that has been under severe stress and is only now being given its first honest chance to move. The crane drove itself out. Slowly, along the western line, on the clay Karl knew was there. The outriggers retracted. The machine found its wheels. 11 minutes from the moment the winch cable first took tension, 11 minutes after 2 days, the Liebherr LTM 1080 was on firm standing with all 4 outriggers clear. The men at the fence made a sound. Not cheering. Something quieter and more involuntary. The collective exhale of a sight that had been holding its breath for 48 hours. Karl disengaged the winch. He coiled the cable onto the drum with the same methodical patience with which he did everything. He drove the Lance back along the western margin to the gate. Pum pum pum. Skal was waiting. Karl stopped the engine. He climbed down and began checking the winch cable for damage. Skal came up beside him. Herr Huber, he said. Karl looked up. 2 days, 3 recovery vehicles, an engineer from Munich. He paused. 11 minutes. The approach was wrong, Karl said. They came from the north over the channel. I came from the west over the clay. Skal looked at the site, at the clean parallel tracks. The Lance had left along the western margin, staying west throughout. Compared to the churned ruts the recovery vehicles had left approaching from the north. We did not know about the channel, he said. No, Karl said. You bought the land, you did not buy the knowledge of it. No reproach, a fact. Skal was quiet. Then he asked the real question, the one none of the recovery engineers had thought to ask. How did you know the western approach would hold you? Karl set down the cable. Because I laid the drainage channel myself, he said. I know where every pipe is. I know where the clay is firm and where it is not. I know this because I spent 14 years working this ground in every season it produces. He looked at Skal. You bought the field. No one can sell you what I know about it. Skal was quiet for a long moment. Then I should have come to the gate on Tuesday. Karl picked up the cable and returned to coiling it. Yes, he said, you should have. Stay with this channel. Subscribe now and hit the bell. We post a new story every single day. The factory was completed 14 months later, 11 days ahead of schedule. Werner Skahl received his bonus. In his project completion report, he wrote a paragraph about what he called soil intelligence, the value of local ground knowledge that cannot be recovered from surveys conducted without long-term field observation. He did not name Karl Huber, but he kept the report in his files for the rest of his career, and he had that paragraph in mind at the beginning of every project he managed afterward. It changed one thing. The first question he asked on every new site was who had worked this ground before the company arrived, and whether it was possible to speak with them. Karl Huber farmed the adjacent land until 1977, when his son Georg took over the operation. The Lanz Bulldog D4016 stayed on the farm. Georg used it for what his father had always used it for, the soft ground work, the wet field tasks, the situations where ground pressure was the critical variable, and the machine's combination of tire width and low-speed torque offered something that newer equipment could not quite match. In 1974, at the District Agricultural Cooperative, a younger farmer who had heard the story secondhand asked Karl to explain what had happened on the construction site. Karl considered the question for a moment, then said, "The engineers knew their trade. They knew loads and bearing capacities and recovery procedures. What they did not know was the ground, and the ground is always the beginning of everything." He said this in the same even tone he used for everything, and the younger farmer wrote it in his notebook and kept the notebook. The Lanz D4016 is still on the Huber farm. Georg's daughter runs the operation now. She starts the engine every spring, the blowtorch, the iron's color, the crank turned. It fires on the fourth rotation, the way it always has. Pum pum pum. Some knowledge cannot be surveyed from the surface, cannot be measured by instruments brought to a site by men who have never spent a single season on it. It can only be carried, deposited in a man's body over years of early mornings and wet autumns, and the patient, faithful work of tending a specific piece of earth through every condition it can produce. What Karl Huber brought to that construction site in September 1969 was not just a tractor with the right tire width. It was 30 years of understanding one piece of ground so completely that the question of what lay beneath it was not a question at all. It was something he simply knew, the way you know the layout of a room you have lived in for 30 years in the dark, without needing a light. The company had bought the land. They had not bought that. And when the modern machines had run out of options and the site had gone quiet, and the engineer from Munich was standing in the mud with nothing left to try, the answer was where it had been since Tuesday morning, at the other side of the fence, on the firm ground, sitting patient on an open iron seat. It had been waiting, the way old iron always waits.